they were supporting a mobile workforce, but not that fully remote workforce. And some of the areas that I've seen it change and really impact are things like VPN deployments. Yep. So with VPN, if you've got this very, everybody, when they're away, they have to go back to a concentrator and one or two ports within or concentration points within an organization to get any traffic out, that can really take up a lot of bandwidth. And things like trying to do patching over that VPN, again, can be, a bandwidth constraint. So orgs are realizing that their old VPN architectures might not be right. And they're looking at more modern VPN architectures like split tunneling and taking advantage of secure direct connections into the cloud. I'm curious what else you've been seeing that's been impacting people.
I've definitely been seeing that. And, a highly mobile workforce was 20% of your people, 50% of your people. So the capacity challenges were very real. And we've seen a lot of approaches to fight through that. On our side, because we are a cloud native solution and we have organizations that had hundreds of thousands of users on our cloud already, what we saw was that the more modernized these organizations already were, the easier their transition was to a fully remote workforce. Now, this may not mean they had everyone on a cloud-enabled solution, but if you start off with 20% of your users on VPN and you don't have the capacity to go to 100% of your users on VPN, that's a much bigger hill to climb than if you start off with 20% of your users on a cloud-enabled remote solution, and expanding to 100% is a license expansion in the cloud, and then touching those other 80% of your users, which is definitely non-trivial.
Right.
So I just think the lesson we've learned there is this was an acceleration of a modernization trend that already existed, and the farther along that curve an organization was, maybe the clearer path they had to get to where they needed to be in a hurry.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said that we've seen 2 years of transformation in 2 months. And it really did step up, I think, for a lot of organizations. And you make an excellent point that the companies that were already fairly well along that path had a little bit of a leg up. But it's been a struggle for the companies that hadn't been preparing and hadn't started a true remote work transformation. But I think now at this point, most organizations have caught up, maybe changed what they were focusing on. I was just reading something, a report from Hitachi this morning, that 89% of respondents to their most recent survey said that cybersecurity was now one of their top priorities. I kind of wish it had been everybody's top priority before, but and 82% said that remote enablement was. So I think we've changed or focused our lens a little. And unfortunately, I think that the attackers have changed their lens a little bit. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you've been seeing in terms of the human-operated ransomware campaigns, especially after the COVID pandemic started to pick up.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that we've seen is that the malware threats really tried to capitalize on a very human instinct to look for information, on, frankly, the fear that comes with a circumstance like this. So there were really two high-level elements to me. One was the traditional attacks that are rebranded in a new light for COVID-19. So you're looking for information on infection in your environment, and they stand up a fake website that delivers malware. You're looking for safety, for masks, for PPE. You're looking for research. So there was a lot of attempts to capitalize on what people would be searching for and creating new attack vectors based on where people are going. But I think another thing that hasn't gotten quite as much attention is that the panic around getting everybody onto remote work really meant that there were a lot more back-end runs. Your attention is all the way over here, so we're going to try to sneak in while you're distracted. So ZScaler's global cloud intercepts and provides visibility and content inspection for outbound traffic to internet and software as a service for some of the largest companies in the world. And our threat labs went through and identified zero-day attacks, zero-day threats around malware and ransomware that was targeted for COVID-19. There's a lot of research available. And what it really pointed at is moving remote users onto the corporate network is one challenge. Do you carry them through a VPN? Do you carry them through a cloud-enabled zero trust access solution? But the other challenge is protecting those users' outbound traffic. And that's the real trade-off. Do you want to perpetuate the traditional network-centric model of carrying a full tunnel VPN back to a data center to send the outbound traffic out through a security stack? Your VPN may not be able to handle it. You may not have the bandwidth. You may not have the licensing to do that. Whereas, again, the more distributed, the more scalable, the more cloud-enabled those solutions were, the easier it was to protect the outbound traffic as well as the inbound traffic. So the rise of these new attacks has really led to a rethinking of what zero trust means in some way, because it's no longer just the original definition of make sure you have as much visibility and control over internal users going to on-premise applications as you do over remote users going to on-premise apps. Now we need zero trust access for remote users going outbound to the internet to protect the user from the threats rather than to protect the application from the user. I think that's going to drive a series of changes in the understanding of zero trust for years to come. What about you? How do you tackle that?
I completely agree on that. Especially looking at zero trust differently. We have something that we say about that zero trust isn't a product, it's an approach. And yes, as organizations now are looking at what about if hey, we may all be supporting remote work or a predominantly remote workforce for a long time. And how do we change that shift in mindset and looking at the technology to support this fully remote workforce? We also saw some similarities to what your research teams were seeing with the human-operated ransomware gangs after the pivot to COVID. So interestingly, we saw, as you're talking about the lures and the sites where if I want to get information on PPE, we were seeing that too, where they were using a very similar approach. And the infrastructure has not, we didn't see that changing. You saw like the standard malware names that you would expect, TrickBot and Emotet, but instead of coming in a phishing email that said something like, hey, click here because you owe this invoice, or click here because you can win a gift certificate if you just fill out the survey, we started to see the emails, the phishing emails had lures like, this is, the CDC has new information on vaccine readiness. And
yeah, absolutely.
If you want your stimulus check, for example. The other thing we saw with them was that a lot of persistence has been built up. These human-operated gangs, they, in addition to launching ransomware, they tend to gain persistence and wait for the most appropriate time. And this really broke my heart, looking at the research, but it's also, I sort of wonder, why do I get surprised by it? Because criminals are gonna crime, but a lot of these ransomware gangs were actually turning on and taking the opportunity for targets that were very, very heavily into the response for COVID. So health systems, for example, aid organizations, those
local governments.
Exactly, yeah, which is it's discouraging, but of course that's the criminals, and it's a good reminder why in cyber defense we have to be prepared for all kinds of attacks, and also to prepare, I think, our remote users too, the people that are at our companies that are doing their jobs and concentrating on their work but aren't necessarily cybersecurity professionals. And any thoughts, Lisa, on how to approach security awareness with your remote workers?
So I have perhaps a heretical take on this, which is I don't think it should be the user's responsibility to protect themselves on the internet. I believe that there is absolutely a place for the kind of traditional security training of don't click stuff and use a strong password. But realistically, I was really, really struck by the keynote speech that Wendy Nather gave at RSA this year on democratizing security. And she had a great analogy, which is, we have all these security tools. We expect users to jump through hoops to be safe. Security should be like a spoon. every culture has the equivalent of a spoon, and it's immediately obvious what to do with it. And there are very few people who use spoons incorrectly. So I believe that we should be building tools and solutions and architectures that secure the user with a minimum of interaction from the user, with a minimum of expectation on the user. If I'm a worker in a hospital, the last thing I need is an intrusive security process that I have to jump through hoops to support the patients that I'm supporting. But it's critically important that the hospital infrastructure be safe. It's critically important that the patient's data be protected. So why put that on a nurse or a doctor? These tools have slowly been evolving to a more user-friendly stance. And I think that at this point, security awareness is about deploying solutions that have the best user experience possible so that the user isn't solely responsible for this problem. What about you?
Yeah, I do. I also +1 for anybody that has the opportunity to watch Wendy's keynote from RSA, because it's great. She's even got the prop of the spoon, to show us, and it's a great example of that. We, and security, we do need to think about how we enable technology that, at the same time that increases the protection for the business, is also increasing the user experience. So things like passwordless, you don't need a ton of training when you start moving to passwordless. If people are using their fingerprint or their face to log in, then the training is actually fairly minimal, as opposed to training for password hygiene and secure password retention. So I think that moving towards technology as much as possible, that's going to help people to be able to connect as securely as they can. And also, I am very much in the camp of positive reinforcement.
Yes.
the carrot versus this stick. So with user awareness, looking for those pops of opportunity to help your users with training. Don't slam them down if they've clicked on the fish. Take advantage of the fact that when we have that little bit of adrenaline, we tend to learn. And instead of making people feel bad, taking that opportunity to help them understand what maybe they could have identified in that email that was coming in, and combine those two things, because I don't think technology will ever solve all of our problems, but can it be a real support to humans to make the experience a little bit better.
Certainly. And I think this is one of those areas where the integration of multiple leading technologies can build a solution that's greater than the sum of its parts. If you combine the great strides that Microsoft has made with conditional access in Azure AD, and then you make that information available as context for an access control decision in a cloud-enabled access solution, you can, again, you're not just depending on the user to do the right thing. The user has strong authentication, but the context of the request, are they coming from a corporate device or a personal device? That may be more important now than ever. Is it a managed or unmanaged device? What resource are they asking for? And do you want to give them access holistically? The human, their role, the other information we have about them, what device they're on, the information we have about the device, the resource they're requesting, maybe even feeding in other types of contexts like reputational information or threat intelligence, and bringing all of these technologies together in the background transparently to the user to make an intelligent security decision where the security solution can actually end up enabling users rather than being an impediment. So when I was, in a previous lifetime, 20 some years ago, I worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield in North Carolina. And when a business unit came to us and asked for a firewall policy, we had a default deny, right? And if they wanted an exception, we asked them to jump through hoops to justify their exception. So our default answer was no, unless you justify why you should. And I think that the beautiful change that's happened over the last 2 decades, that was what Blue Cross needed to do to be secure with the technology we had at the time. But today, we can now be in a more enabling perspective as a cybersecurity practitioner to say to a CDO or an application owner, we can make your application available more seamlessly and more securely than ever before by leveraging these back-end technologies. So we can enable you to do things that simply wouldn't have been feasible at scale or wouldn't have been possible based on the lack of background data, bringing together context, granularity, visibility in a way that is really an enabler.
And that's such an important point that you brought up, that thread of where technology was and where technology is. And I feel like we've seen a lot of that since COVID, where there's been this, what was available to us. Telehealth has been available to us for a number of years. Now, there were some stops and starts if you go back 15, 10 years ago even. But in the last couple of years, telehealth had really advanced to a point where it was ready for more use than it was getting. But it took people not being able to go into the office to understand, oh, yes, I can. And I think that there's a lot with security as well, as you pointed out about things like conditional access. I remember trying to do rules back in the day around, right? Around identity and well, if somebody's out of the office, can we just get that from the HR system? And then can we figure out? And it was just so brittle and it kept breaking. But if you haven't looked at conditional access lately, you haven't seen it, because the technology really has advanced, it has changed. I get it, as people, we've been doing this a long time. I understand that not everything is perfect yet, but the scope and the scale of what we can look to technology for has truly stepped up, and I think is prepared us now actually to be much readier for being healthy in this new, very heavily remote work world. And sometimes when people ask me about conditional access and they're trying to understand it, I equate it a little bit to fraud detection in financial services. Because if you've got a credit card, you might remember years ago that the fraud detection on the back end was not great. I don't know, but have you ever had a credit card where somebody, like years ago, they went shopping? Yeah, I did too. I finally got a call one day my card had been stolen in the afternoon. I didn't know. Got a call while I was having dinner that night, and they're like, "Are you in Rhode Island buying $500 worth of sneakers?" I'm like, "I am not." And
mine was plane tickets in Italy. Yes.
Oh, well, see, that's even that's even cooler. But yeah, now the last time there was fraud on my credit card, I'm not kidding you, it was a 1 cent charge or $1 charge, 1 cent or $1, $1 charge, maybe 1 cent charge. And that within 5 minutes of that charge, they were on the phone to me. The other one was I had lunch with a colleague at Black Hat in Las Vegas a year or two ago, and I paid for it as I was walking out of the restaurant. My bank called me, and that's a little bit of conditional access has gotten that good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the key points is ease of use, not only for the user but for the administrator, because you're right. It did feel a lot like rocket science when these technologies were first introduced, and trying to especially figure out an integration where not only were you making it all work in a Microsoft ecosystem, but now you were integrating that context to make it useful to other tools. But we've really reached a point where the documentation is good, the admin consoles have got a much better user experience, and it's really within the reach of even a smaller and less resource blessed organization to be able to implement this stuff, do it a phase at a time, get the auth working first, then start to tie in maybe context about the user, then start to tie in context about the device. But it's very achievable in a way that it really wasn't or was very painful to do even a decade ago.
Yeah, and you make such a wonderful point there about taking it a phased approach. It can be so tempting to want to, we've identified a problem. There's technology. Let's just fix it all at once. I worked with a large company that they finally decided, all right, we're going to change our application security program. We're going to use a secure software development lifecycle. They had thousands of developers, and they actually wanted to launch out both SaaS, both static and dynamic application security testing day one with no training because they're like, these tools are so easy to use. Yeah. And I was really very hard trying to have them not do that. But they were just so excited, and they understood that, they really wanted to get started with the program, but ultimately they did have to step back a little bit and phase, because as tempting as good as the technology is, and as tempting as it is sometimes to just launch everything right at once, sometimes, as you mentioned, taking that step through approach and then building on success can be actually the better path forward.
There's another aspect to the human element there, which is that change is hard. I know I had probably 20 years of experience with firewall, VPN, port-based layer 2 admission control. And when a colleague of mine who I'd worked with previously, Manoj Apte, he was the chief strategy officer at ZScaler, and he reached out to me and he said, you should come over here. We're doing something really cool. And I said, I love what I'm doing. We're doing amazing things. Why would I leave? And he said, we're doing remote access with no inbound listener. And I think my response was something along the lines of, Manoj, if I didn't know you personally, I'd be blocking you out of my DMs right now. How is that even a thing? Because I was so focused on the context that I came from that I could not conceive of how you could do that. And what we find is it's a human impulse to go with what you know, what you're comfortable with. I don't want to walk into an organization and say, throw away your outbound security stack and send all your data to the cloud in one go. I don't want to walk in and say, tear down your VPN and send us all of your internal traffic. I want to say, let's put this in parallel to what you're currently doing. You still have all the protections that you currently have. You still have the thing that you're familiar with, but let's start exploring this new approach. And then that gives them the time to get a comfort level, to understand the benefits, to address any areas where their organization may have to flex a little, or where our solution may have to flex a little. And I think that that's a big indicator of success for a project is, if it's driven top down and the people with their hands on the keyboard don't understand it and aren't comfortable implementing it, they're the ones who are on the pager at 3 o'clock in the morning. We have to give practitioners a path to say, you can keep the thing that you currently have. You can stand up this thing that you want to replace it with in parallel. You can make sure that you're comfortable and confident, and then you can transition to it organically. You can do it one use case at a time, one user community at a time, one resource at a time, so that we're not asking people to jump off a cliff and trust that we have given them a parachute that opens.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's exactly. And I went into a company a few years ago, and they had 8 different endpoint agents on most, and they were complaining that, it's really slow. And I asked why, and it was partly that they were trying to give these parallel options. It was time at that point at 8 agents. It was time to decide what was working and what wasn't. But you're exactly right, to allow tech teams and for them to see, if this is working out better or worse. Sometimes people and conditioning, can be some of the biggest blockers to transformation and change and security. And I won't lie, I was really resistant to the cloud at first because I felt like no one's going to be as secure with my data as I am. But over time, looking at with what the cloud can actually bring and how it's, in fact, it's a security enhancer, it's a security imperative because of what you can see. But some orgs, I noticed that they went into the cloud exactly the way you said. They went with a couple of teams or a couple of workloads or a couple of use cases and watched that, okay, this is working more easily, especially in very remote distributed environments. Even pre-COVID, seeing that for teams, global teams that were trying to collaborate, the cloud is that glue that can knit everybody, stitch everybody together. So I mixed my metaphor on that, but the cloud being the great connector and not something that you need to be scared of. And you're just so right on that it's really about giving options and letting the teams see, how people adopt it. And then you sometimes find the users, they become the champions themselves. They're like, this is better than what was happening before.
And it's custom. There's no cookie cutter solution. You can't say that, well, your peer company did this, so you're going to do it in exactly the same way. every organization needs to find their own path to the cloud. And some of those organizations may do it faster, some may do it more conservatively. But I think that really breaking the giant, intimidating concept into small, manageable problem spaces and then tackling that, you do phase one, you learn from phase one, you maybe evolve your plan for phase two a little bit based on what you learned. But you have a good strategic go forward path that is both holistic, but also each element of it can evolve with what you learned from the previous element.
A question, do you think that there's any organization that shouldn't be thinking about supporting a remote workforce and enabling with the cloud?
Wow. It would be, so, I mean, obviously there are hands-on tasks, right? Okay, so I do have an answer to that. And again, possibly a little heretical. I believe that I have not yet seen cloud-enabled solutions that I would trust in the communication path between industrial control system components themselves. So if you have a wastewater treatment plant and you have a PLC that's controlling a valve or a sensor, I don't want that conversation mediated by the cloud yet, because there are too many dependencies, because you have a dependency on secure, reliable communications media. And what is that? Maybe that's going to be 5G down the road, but there's got to be redundancy and resiliency in the comms path. So I would say that while I do absolutely believe that there's a case for cloud enabling the access of an operator to get to the edge of an industrial control systems enclave, I do not believe that cloud security, cloud-enabled technologies are at a maturity level yet where I want them controlling my nuclear power plant or my wastewater treatment system. That's off the top of my head. That's the big one that comes to mind for me. What about for you?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's still a big case for intelligent edge. There's still a case for, especially where no latency is acceptable. You need that really rapid communication, like on a manufacturing shop floor. You may observe and monitor and manage from the cloud, absolutely. But yeah, as you point, those pieces that need to connect, there's still some direct connections that I think there's sense for, and then the cloud comes in as your management component, as your oversight, your governance to what's happening on the shop floor within the industrial control system. But yeah, it's interesting, and I think you make a really good point about as we get faster communications, that this will probably continue to transform. And thinking of that, looking ahead, where would you, for the listeners, where would you say that they should focus about thinking about their transitioning so that they can be healthy in the future?
That's such a huge topic. I think that we've all spent the last 6 months with our hair on fire, and we've been in reaction mode. We've been trying to protect our colleagues, our families, our communities. We've been trying to get everybody onto remote work and then figure out what that looks like, figure out what the processes are that need to change along with the technology, the people side of it, as well as the underlying connectivity. Now it feels like we're entering a next phase of COVID where, there's a realization that this is not going away anytime soon. It's not a short term. We're going to be doing this 6 months from now, almost certainly. We may well be doing it a year from now. And we need to find equilibrium over that shorter near-term future. But at the same time, I'm also seeing a shift in the CISO conversations, the CIO, the CTO, to say the ground has moved underneath us and we have responded. We have a new fundamental connection, topology, a new fundamental way of working. What does that now do to our strategic 3-year plan, our 5-year plan? How do we build on the solutions we've put in place to enable the company, to enable the business? What do we carry into the future from here? And I think, again, organizations that already had an IT modernization plan, whether that was cloud migration, whether it was, modernizing unified communications, whether it was changing the way that third parties access the environment, all of those plans really, as you said, got accelerated, 2 years growth in 2 months. And we may be I think there's a very real element where we're off balance a little bit, because some of the things that we wanted to do happened all at once, and some of them got totally put on the back burner and are behind. So we need to re-level what is important to the business, what will help the business survive this disruptive period and grow. And how do we, okay, we've got this working over here. How can we build on the thing that we just put in place? But also, how can we start to put priority back on the things that got deprioritized to pay for it and all the cycles that went into enabling it?
Yeah, back to that Hitachi where we've now got, what is it, 89%. People say cybersecurity is important. Well, okay, what some of the things that got deprecated were innovation and customer satisfaction. So yeah, and those, as we know, are all really important parts of a business too. So you're right, there may be a rebalancing as orgs go forward. And I hope that we take these lessons and don't forget them. That's, looking ahead, I really hope, I remember back when H1N1 was kind of an Ebola, were in the news, but did not, have the impact that COVID had. There was a lot of talk for a little while about pandemic planning and crisis planning, and then we all went back to, but everything's fine. So I hope that orgs keep sort of a health crisis, pandemic kind of, or even environmental crisis plan as part of their response playbooks, because this is the world is changing, and it does make sense to be prepared for it. And it's hard. Again, I think this is where the human part comes in. Even as I'm saying this, a part of me feels like, oh gosh, I hope we never have to see anything that's terrible again. But the reality is we may. That being prepared, it's like nobody wants to write out their will. But writing out your will is a really good way to save your family a whole lot of pain and suffering and legal fees afterwards if you die intestate. So yes, I hope that there'll be this planning, taking it forward into the future.
Yeah, I think a lot of people pulled their business continuity plans off the shelf, figured out where they worked and where they didn't, have executed on them, but that's not finished, right? Okay, so we got through the immediate crisis. Now we need to go back to the BCP and say the starting point is different. So what does business continuity look like post this initial push? And what are the lessons that we've learned that will help us with the next one? One of the most important lessons that I think was learned is that when forced, an organization actually can do this at scale. And this is a heck of a forcing function, and I would really prefer that nobody ever have to do an initiative like this under pressure like this again. But I hope also that a lot of organizations discovered that their users are more resilient than maybe they think, and that their capacity to absorb change may be higher than was expected, and that they could leverage that in a non-panic fashion to maybe be a little more ambitious in how they evolve into a more modern way of doing business, a more modern way of applying security approaches.
Yeah, that makes me think of two things. One is that, sometimes I've been talking about this topic in the last few months, and I've had questions about, but nobody could have predicted exactly what happened with COVID. And that's not about what a crisis planning or incident response to crisis planning is about. Obviously, nobody can predict the future. What we can do is we can model different kinds of scenarios. Like, for example, what if people can't come into the office? That's a scenario that can be modeled. What causes that could be a variety of different things. But I think when people think of planning, it's not about predicting the future. We get it. If we could predict the future, we'd all, go become like lottery winners. But it's about planning and modeling different kinds of scenarios, which we can do and we can think of, and getting prepared for that. And also, I loved your point about how people can we're actually more resilient sometimes than we give ourselves credit for. And I'm not sure how it was at ZScaler, but I can say at Microsoft, those first couple of weeks, on my team, we were like on Teams sending each other pictures of like open packs of cookies and GIFs of people crying, because it was just this very, how are we going to deal with this and what's going to happen? And now we are just, this is how we work and this is who we are, and we're very comfortable with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my team is a little different because we were all of us heavy travelers because we are out with our customers and our prospects talking through these types of transformations, talking through the new solutions and new technologies and what that enables for the organization. I went personally from 80% travel, and I had been 50 to 80% for over 15 years, to shelter in place, do not leave your house. So, number one, I'm really lucky that my partner didn't kill me in the first 2 weeks because he would have been fully justified because I was a wreck. And number two, our whole team, we had to redefine how we worked in maybe the opposite direction because we were used to being mobile, but we weren't used to being remote, to go back to that initial conversation, not in that way. So I think that every organization has evolved a response that really can be built on in the future. Do we need to bring all of our employees back into the office? If you're a hospital, probably, but maybe there are some administrative functions that can be done remotely that weren't considered before. If you are, an organization that's more a knowledge organization than a hands-on organization, we're seeing a bunch of the big companies in Silicon Valley have already said that they are going to at least have the option to be fully remote in the future. That, a year ago, there was no driver for that. So I do think that there are some institutional assumptions that were challenged and overturned by this. And hopefully that makes all of those institutions more flexible and more resilient, as you say.
Yeah, and I completely agree on that flexibility point because, especially like some companies have big campuses, people love to come together on the campus. It's a way to just build engagement. But you look at other organizations that maybe everybody was just in a cube somewhere in an expensive downtown building, and there wasn't that engagement and connection. And companies may be looking at, do we need to spend the money to have these, have all this space, or maybe create more communal spaces where people can come in. When I worked for the Big Four, we had this concept of hoteling, and it was in the 90s. Yes. And I sort of expected there'd be a lot more remote work and flexibility. And for some reason, 2019, it seems like, some big companies were calling everybody back, and we were acting like we didn't have these tools that enabled us to do engagement remotely.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's not just within a company, but it's the whole ecosystem that the company operates in. So it's third parties, it's partnerships, and it can be technology partners as well as business partners. So when you think about that, there's a real question around how much control do you want to give MDR partners and how much do you trust your third parties? Where would you start to think about that?
Yeah, MDR is a really interesting space, the managed detection and response space, because it's kind of split up. There's the managed endpoint, and some companies are just saying, just manage my endpoints. And then there's that managed extended detection and response. But a lot of the big pull, and even at large and small organizations, is that R part. Respond for me, respond with me, be my extra set of eyes. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how companies adopt and change to that movement, because on the one hand, why do we go to the cloud? We go to the cloud because we're getting economies of security scale in the sense of expertise, or that's one thing that we're getting from it. With MDR, MXDR, you get that same thing. You get this big, deep bench of security expertise, but now instead of them housing your data, you're saying, I'm going to allow you to make some decisions about, things like, do I shut this port down on the firewall, or does this host get isolated while it's the CEO's endpoint? Is that okay to go ahead and isolate that? And who's going to get in trouble? Because sure, you're my vendor doing the response, but I'm the IT person or the security person who hired you. And is the CEO going to come back and yell at. So these kinds of questions, I think, are going to be really interesting, and organizations are now thinking through how much control they want to give. And I think a good benchmark for them is to try and give the control that they can afford. And what I mean by that is that if you don't have that security expertise, and the trade-off is the attacker is getting through your system and doing something damaging to your business and your organization, then having a third party do the response for you may be the better choice, even if every response isn't perfect, because it's very hard when you're running a complex system. Every response choice may not be the right one. There could be some hiccups. A system may get pulled offline or stopped temporarily from communication. So I think that works. That really, think about what they can do and where that trade-off is. If you have a really expert security team, work with your provider to figure out what response is acceptable. Maybe the response is not they take action. Maybe it's that they recommend the action and make sure that they escalate to the right person within the other company that can actually do that. Or in some smaller companies, it may be right to say, we just don't have the security bench or expertise. So if you got to shut the firewall down, I'm going to say, go ahead.
Yep. I worked at an organization back when NIMDA hit where our response was we disconnected the company from the internet. And it was a judgment call that was made by the director of the network security team. And boy, did he have to answer to the CEO. But he came in and he said, we saw the reports spreading. We saw what it was doing to other companies. And we didn't want to be in the position of trying to track it down and clean it up internally. The only way to ensure that was to take ourselves offline. And that cost real money. And it was after, but it was less of a pain to clean up after than a widespread infection internally, again, 20 some odd years ago. So I think that some of those decisions, a smaller organization may also benefit from outsourcing those decisions to a third party, an MDR partner, because there may be less political fear of, we're paying you for this service. You need to make the hard decisions for us without fear of what the repercussions will be. And you'll have to explain it for sure, but it's not, I'm going to get yelled at personally by the CEO kind of level.
Right. And then they're having that, because they're looking at these providers or, they're doing detection and response for, hundreds of customers, maybe thousands of customers. So they're also getting a better handle on what the right action is. So you get a little bit of that when, behind you when you're saying, why was this decision made? Well, they've got the expertise, but it also brings up the issue of third parties in general. And how do we trust? So you have to ask us about an MDR provider, but any third party that we're doing business with, we're now bringing into our networks, bringing into our clouds, bringing into our workloads. How do you manage and track that security with third parties?
It's always been a tough question, and it's more important than ever now. And I think the real key for mitigating third party risk is to recognize sort of that transient risk. If you're exposed to your third party, they're also exposed to their third parties who are exposed to their third parties. You may have third and fourth and fifth order exposure that you don't know about. And the fundamental requirement for defense against that is least privilege access, which can be really hard to get to. It's easy to say, okay, I have an HVAC vendor and I'm only going to let them touch the HVAC system. That's a goal. That's not a plan. And so figuring out how to implement that, looking at zero trust access solutions, but fundamentally, even below that, looking at visibility. What do they need to perform their duties? There have been there's a long and glorious tradition of business to business VPN. And a business to business VPN is basically a site to site tunnel from their network to yours, where you have to lock down everything you don't want them to see. It is a most privileged transport that you then have to force to be least privileged. And I think there's a real shift away from that model of having private WAN connections, of having site to site connections, where you can really isolate a third party user community to specific resources and deploy a zero trust solution for third party as well that gives you full visibility, full accountability, and starts with, give me a list of allowed resources and that's all you get. Not give me the network and then tell me what you don't get to.
Yes, I completely agree. Start with least privilege is really, it can be tempting. You kind of want to flatten the access even for your third parties, but least privilege, absolutely. It's the way to give us, virtual segmentation in a sense at that access level. And also you can do things like, look at if your third party, what have they attested to? If they're a
Yes.
cloud provider, for example, I'm a big fan of the STAR registry at the CSA
Mhm.
because it gives you a sense. Does it give you 100% knowledge that there's going to be no problem with a third party? No, 100% is that's a hard number to hit, but it gives you they're attesting out to what they're committing to, looking at what controls they have in place, and you can compare that to what your own needs are. And also, I think with vendors that are willing to share with you things like their star registry, if they've done ISO, their SSAE, for example, SOC 1 and 2, it also gives you a sense that they've got some transparency, that they're willing to share with you what you're doing. Because if a vendor says, I don't know what that is, or I have nothing to share, that could be
Yeah.
a red flag that I really want to do business with you.
It's at least an indicator of a level or lack of maturity.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Well, these have been really great topics, but I think that hopefully we also have some topics or questions suggested by the audience. So, for the CyberXchange folks, is there anything that's popped up that we could tackle from that side?
Yes, assuming you can hear me just well, I will jump into a couple of the questions that we've received from a
We're
variety of
waiting for
social
I
media
think Jordan
sources.
is on mute. There we go.
Ah,
All right, so assuming you can hear me just well, you can give me a quick thumbs up. I will begin to
yes?
read out some of the questions that are coming our way from social media and a variety of sources. Once again, thank you to the CyberX team for making this very seamless. The first question that has come our way is this aspect on understanding how health checks are being done in the new normal, security health checks. The question reads, security health checks are normally processes where you go through a checklist of certain things, but you have conversations with individuals, conversations with teams as well. How has these security health checks changed in the new normal? And more importantly, are there any frameworks that you would recommend for good security health checks?
Diana, you want to grab that?
Sure. So I think that the security health checks overall are looking fairly similar to what they were before, in terms of that you want to make sure that there are controls and policies in place that the company needs to make sure are being adhered to. There is a bigger focus now on remote work and securing the remote worker, because now you're doing that health check not of your team that's on site or predominantly on site, but now really taking into account that for a lot of companies, it's 100% that are remote. As far as the frameworks that people are using, I see that change, company by company. I mean, there are some companies that they loved the NIST CSF, and the NIST CSF is they use that. They somehow find a way to expand that to everything. I still know some companies that they find PCI DSS, that's their baseline. It's weird because I know it's the credit card data security standard, but a lot of companies feel like, oh, this is a good level set for us. We're using it across the organization. So I've seen a lot of different kinds of ISOs. Another one that pops up. So I see a lot of different ones, but I would say that NIST CSF tends to be one of the bigger ones that is used across orgs. How about you, Lisa?
If I had to pick one, it would be that NIST cybersecurity framework for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Jordan, what else?
The next question again stays true to the topic, which is on health checks, and talks about the changing perimeters of security. The question reads as follows. It says that now we are required to also do health checks within the home, security health checks again. How can you establish trust if someone says they have something in place versus actually having something in place at the home? Are there privacy concerns with running security health checks in home environments of our remote workers?
Yeah, you want me to go, or you want to go, Lisa?
You go for it, and then I also have some thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, well, certainly if you're running a test on a remote home network without letting the employee know that that's something you're going to do, that could definitely be an issue. So whatever you do that you're checking, you want to make sure that the employees understand, just as we have acceptable use policies and policies that employees sign when they come into a business and they agree what to do and what not to do on the corporate network. Have conversations with them about what to do and what not to do on the home network. And I think really focus on not trying to catch people out and do like remote, do testing without telling them, but really focus on helping the employee to understand what they need to do and to be better and to be really empathic to the situations that employees are dealing with. So some employees, a lot of companies have gone to BYOD. So it's your own device that you brought into the company, and now you're at home working. Guess what? Your kid's also at home, and they need a laptop maybe to get onto the school system. So you allow them to install software for that. Or you're just an employee that's now suddenly, I know I have to do this, Lisa, you probably do too with all the public speaking you do, but I think I've got every single video conferencing software under the sun installed. And I need to be able to do that to do my job. Yes, it'd be great if everybody used Teams, but guess what? That's not the reality yet. So try and have a little bit of empathy with your employees and explain to them what they can and can't do. Consider, for example, actually bringing in, taking the BYOD policy and turning it back around, drop ship them a device and say, this is the device for the business. And now times have changed. BYOD was great when we were all coming to the office. Now we want you to have a dedicated just for work laptop. So your own laptop, your child can be online and go into school with it. And also, again, empathy. Try and think about what are ways that you can help that employee do you want to give them guidance on how to set up their home network instead of remote scanning on them, saying, we can offer you a home health check if you'd like us to do that, and then give you a guidance on how to do things like setting up perhaps a DMZ within your organization or buying a better router or even maybe supplying routers or security equipment for the home office. So you can, without a doubt, help the employees secure their home office, but I would definitely take much more of a collaborative, empathic approach to helping them secure their environment instead of just, hey, we're scanning this and you've got something wrong.
I think this is a great place to apply the core principle of zero trust, which is every network is untrusted. The user's home network is no more and no less untrusted than the Starbucks that they may have worked in as a mobile worker or the hotel that they may have sat in when they came to an employee conference somewhere. So I think that designing security solutions that operate securely and operate based on context, maybe you want to allow users to check their email from a personal device because there's a number of protections in place on the email server to ensure that that data is protected, that the communications are protected, but there are sensitive internal resources that you want them to be on a corporate asset for. So finding ways to deploy various levels of context-based access to find a happy medium between allowing the user to work as comfortably and as flexibly as possible and still ensuring that you have visibility and granularity of control over what they touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is the place for zero trust. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We have another 5 minutes and we have 2 more questions, actually 3, but we'll try and run through as many as we can. If we can't, people can ask it on www.siberexchange.ca and our guests will gladly respond to you directly there. The next question talks about the relationship between data sharing between private enterprises and government organizations. I guess this comes from the aspect of contact tracing and having now to see a lot of private sector organizations sharing information with the government on the status of their employees, their health records, if they've been in contact with somebody, their travel records, so on and so forth. What's your perspective on this, and what are some good guidelines that both public and private sector organizations can follow when it comes to data sharing, specifically around COVID-19?
That's a real large new area that I don't think there are very clear guardrails yet. It's not completely new. Private organizations have had to share some employee data with the government forever, for tax purposes, for, if you're working in a cleared environment or for a government-related organization that there may be sensitivity around travel to certain countries. So I think that we are figuring out as a society where the boundaries are of what personal information it is okay to share, what personal information it's not okay to share. I think the most critical element of that is transparency. I don't know that I have any opinion about what a company should or shouldn't be sharing, but I absolutely have an opinion that whatever they share, it should be absolutely transparent to the user whose data they're sharing. Diana, what do you think?
Yeah, you nailed that with transparency. Let's go back to the core tenets, right? Privacy is a human right. And two of the main ways to ensure privacy for people online is one, to get their consent about what how you're gonna share the data, what you're gonna do with the data. Make sure that the person is able to consent about how their data is shared, and then being, exactly as you said, very transparent about what it is that they're consenting to. And this has been, we've had this for a long time in the privacy space. You look at things like GDPR and CCPA, they go back to, as Lisa said, transparency, also adding consent, and then for those people that are using the data, because it is going to be important to find out things. For example, in health, we need to have, you get big data sets, and you understand who's responding to any drug or vaccine, right? Why do people get heart attacks? One group gets is more likely to get heart attacks than another one. Now we've just transitioned that. Now we're very focused on the COVID vaccines, and why are some people asymptomatic and other people are unfortunately suffering greatly and dying. But let's pull it back to privacy is a human right, consent, and transparency. And I think we can move forward from there.
Definitely.
Thank you. We'll jump into the next question, and this refers to the frequency of security health checks. In some organizations, standards would indicate that you have your security health checks once every quarter, and in some cases, once every year. But given that business plans and business processes are changing on a bi-weekly basis right now, how do you make a fair assumption on how frequently you should be conducting security health checks, especially because they cost time and resources?
Yeah. So I know we're just about, so I'm going to be real quick, but I think that, the days of quarterly scanning are well over. This is 2020, and things that, life moves pretty fast, and we need to be focusing on things in more of a continuous monitoring. So you may do an audit or an assessment against a particular regulation on whatever time periodicity that is required for that audit or assessment. But as far as security health, you should be doing some level of continuous 24/7, 365 monitoring. And if you don't have the resources at your organization to do that, that's where some of those third parties can help to do that for you. Lisa?
Absolutely. It's not a time-driven check anymore. It's proactive alerting when things look funny.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've got another 40 seconds or so I'll turn it over back to you for some closing comments. And if there are more questions, which there were, they can be dropped into www.siberexchange.ca, and our guests will definitely log in and try and respond to them. Back to you now.
Diana?
All right. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I've missed you, so it's been great to reconnect here. And I hope to see you, and I hope this was helpful for people. And I hope to be able to see you again in person very soon.
I feel the same way. I really appreciate everyone who joined us today, and I hope that we all find a way forward through the disruptive times that we live in to a stronger, more resilient, and more productive place to be, both cybersecurity-wise and in whatever business or pursuits that we're following.
To cyber health.
Cheers.
Thank you.